I'm going to start off by stressing the value of a developmental perspective in this topic, of kind of, if you like, including the factor of time into our thinking. I'm then going to do what I'm calling here camouflaging revisited. I'd like to present a bit more work that we've done on camouflaging, and particularly asking these questions: why do autistic people camouflage? I think we heard a bit about that in our panel, and I'd like to just share some of the findings that we've made with respect to that. And to also tackle this broader question, which you could put very simply as, is camouflaging a good or a bad thing? And a subsidiary question of, is it really that simple? So I'm going to also have this section on, is camouflaging friend or foe? And then I'm going to talk about the mental health needs of autistic girls and women. And in particular, I'm going to focus on a topic that myself and collaborators have become particularly interested in, which is this overlap between restrictive eating difficulties, and in particular anorexia nervosa, and autism in adolescent girls and in women. And then I'm going to have a few thoughts called, what next? How can we better support girls and women on the autism spectrum? Although I'm going to throw out some ideas. My sense is that much of the rest of this meeting will offer us valuable insights and chances for discussion on that. But I'll put out some ideas of my own there. Okay, so far, I've really been talking cross-sectionally. I've been talking about differences between males and females at any one point in time. And that's fine, that's useful, and in fact, the very, very great majority of research in this area has been cross-sectional. People have tended just to study autism gender differences, autism sex gender differences, cross-sectionally, looking at one particular snapshot and seeing about differences between males and females. But what I argue is that we need, if we really want to understand what's going on here, we need to take a more longitudinal perspective. We need to think about gender differences as they evolve and change across the lifespan, if we really want to understand the needs and characteristics of autistic girls and women. And there's certainly suggestive evidence that there's something important going on here with time. When they're diagnosed with autism, females are diagnosed on average later than our males. And we find that their difficulties are often less obvious in childhood than they are later on. So Michelle Dean's work and the paper that we wrote both showed that certainly in the kind of primary school years in particular, the difficulties of autistic girls were more likely to be overlooked than were those of autistic boys. But that became less true as time went by. We also know that there's some evidence that women tend to present to services later than males. And interestingly, if you look at studies that look at levels of autistic traits, so continuously measured dimensional autistic traits in males and females, if you look at those studies in children, you see substantial differences. You see that the boys, on average, I'm not talking necessarily about autistic boys, but just boys in the general population, tend to score quite a bit higher than girls in terms of autistic traits. If you look at those sorts of studies in adulthood, where people have measured dimensionally autistic traits in adult men and women, you see much smaller gender differences, even in some studies non-existent gender differences. So all of these are suggestive of this idea that there's something important going on here to do with time, to do with developmental trajectories and change over time. And to kind of get us into thinking about this, and also to kind of share with you an autistic person's perspective, I've got a couple of video clips I'd like to show you from someone who we'll call Holly. So this is somebody who came to our clinic when she was 9 years old, and did actually receive a diagnosis of autism, although had previously been missed, if you like, was struggling at school, had come into contact with services, and had not been diagnosed with autism. But we saw her at 9 and diagnosed her. And then, I think it was about 10 years later, she kindly agreed to come back and talk to us and to help in the preparation of some training materials we were making, to record a video just reflecting on her experiences since her diagnosis. So I think this is useful just in a general sense of conveying something about this woman's experience, but I hope also perhaps giving you a sense of just sort of change over time and how important that might be when we're thinking about this topic. So this is Holly, interviewed by my friend and colleague Rebecca Chilvers when she was a 9-year-old. And some of you will recognize this interview is based on a particular section of the ADOS that looks at friendship and relationships. So there she is, age 9, just a little snippet there of her in an ADOS. So now let's meet Holly again when she came back to see us 10 years later, and she's sort of talking about various aspects of her life. So, I mean, we can talk about that clip later if people are interested. But one of the things I take from it is that when I saw that snippet of her at 9, you don't get a sense of somebody with really severe difficulties in a sense. I mean, I know that's just a snippet. That's not the whole sort of picture, obviously, it's just a tiny bit of the assessment, but then when you hear about her talking about her kind of adolescent life, you get a sense of actually how problematic some of these quite subtle difficulties she'd experienced had been for her. And I think that was something that let's just hold that in mind as I now present to you a little bit of data about looking at the development of gender differences over time and raise this question of whether there might be different trajectories of autistic difficulties for males and females. Now, interestingly, this is not an idea that I can claim to be original or to be mine, and in fact, it was first suggested in 1944 by this gentleman here, who is Hans Asperger, in his white coat there, I assume in his clinic in Austria. And one of the things that puzzled him about autism was that he saw so few girls in his clinic. And one thing he mused when he was thinking about that was it could be that autistic traits in the female become evident only after puberty. We just do not know. It's a kind of interesting idea, and nobody's tested it to date, but we've recently done a bit of work having a look at it, and I'd like to just tell you a bit about that. And we did this in a sample called ALSPAC, the Avon Longitudinal Study of Parents and Children. It's based in a city called Bristol in southwest England. And this is a general population birth cohort study. So this is where they recruited pretty much every kid who was born in Bristol in 1990 and the first half of 1991. And brought them into this study and then have assessed them over time on an almost yearly basis, watching the development of these kids in all sorts of different ways. Now, some of the kids have dropped out of the study, but there's still a fairly healthy number who are involved. And so this is where the data I'm about to tell you about come from. And the framework for the study is very much dimensional. Yeah? What I'm going to present to you are not findings from clinical populations of people who have a diagnosis of autism, but rather I'm going to present you findings of dimensionally measured autistic traits in the general population. And in particular, we're looking at the sort of social aspects of autism. So the trait we've measured can be described as the ability to communicate and interact effectively with other people based on a capacity to mentalize, on a capacity to kind of spontaneously make guesses about what is in other people's minds and indeed in your own mind. And we measured that using something called the Social Communication Disorders Checklist, which is a parent report measure. It's pretty short. It's only 12 items because you need a short measure if you're collecting data in such a large sample of people. But nevertheless, although it's short, it has some quite good properties, what we call its psychometric properties, which says that it's quite a good measure in terms of how consistent it is and how accurately it measures what it purports to measure. And I think particularly important is that there's been some studies that have showed that genetic variants that influence autism risk are also influential on where you are on your score on this instrument. So that implies that the kind of social variability that's being measured by the SCDC is of relevance to autism. And we also find, as you might expect from a measure of autism, that this is a trait is measured by the SCDC that continues to be under pretty strong genetic control across the lifespan, from 7, but also at age 16. We had these data at age 7, 10, 13 and 16. So we measured autistic traits of people at age 7, 10, 13 and 16. And in total, we had nearly 10,000 participants who had produced at least enough data to be included in our analysis. And this is a collaboration with John Heron, who sort of looks like a nightclub doorman there, but is actually a very gentle guy who is a very skilled modeler of longitudinal data. That's Liz Pellicano, who used to be at UCL, has sadly just moved to the other side of the world, to Sydney. And we modeled the data to look at this question of whether the developmental trajectories for males and females on these autistic traits differed, with this kind of proposition from Hans Asperger in our minds as to whether there might be some sort of increase in autistic traits for females around puberty. And this is what we found. So let me talk you through this. So along here is, it's not pointing. I'll use the old-fashioned method of a finger. So along here is time. So you can see the 4 measurement points, 7, 10, 13, 16. And then the vertical axis, the x-axis, the y-axis, shows your score on the SCDC, with higher scores showing higher levels of autistic traits. And what we can see is that for the males, which is that top line, there's this kind of shallow U-shaped curve, but it's kind of a picture of stability. Knowing somebody's SCDC score at 7 for a male looks like it's a fairly good prediction of what their SCDC score will be at 16. There's a slight sort of U-shaped decline, but there's basically a picture of stability. For the females, we see something quite different. So age 7 and 10, they are, as we would kind of expect them to be, scoring lower on average than the males. And then something intriguing happens, which is the average score for females on this measure starts to climb. And in fact, by the age of 16, and remember, this is parent report, so we have to be appropriately skeptical, but nevertheless, by the age of 16, the females and the males are scoring at an equivalent level. So this is another way of showing this, which is this models the gender gap, if you like. So at 7, the positive score shows that males are scoring higher. By the age of 16, that's gone. And we looked at these data in a different way, which is to say, instead of modeling the average scores that people get on the SCDC, why don't we look at the proportion of people who are scoring above the clinical cut point? Because that's kind of interesting. That denotes a group of people who have really quite high autistic traits and may well need a bit of help and support. So it'd be interesting to see if that same trend we saw when we just looked at average scores worked in this way. And we saw exactly the same thing. So at age 7, males were more likely to score above the clinical threshold on the SCDC. They were more likely to be identified as being kind of potentially in need of help. But by the age of 16, that effect had disappeared. We had equivalent proportions of males and females scoring above threshold. And interestingly, as you'd expect, I guess, from these data, females had higher odds than males of first being identified by the SCDC in adolescence rather than in childhood. So, I fully, this finding is about to come out in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, so obviously I'd love it if people read the paper and looked into the kind of the small print, if you like, and had a good think about it, because I think this is one of those findings that raises as many questions as it answers. But to me, social communication difficulties escalate in some young people as they enter adolescence. And females are more likely than males to experience that escalation. So it seems to me that there's, broadly speaking, a couple of interpretations of this finding. One is that these females are showing, if you like, genuinely new social communication difficulties. It could be that they didn't have these difficulties when they were younger, and then something happened, maybe something related to biological changes around puberty, that caused them to develop these difficulties. Now, the alternative explanation, an alternative way of thinking about these data, is that perhaps these females did have subtle social communication difficulties when they were younger, but they only became overt, they only became noticeable as they became older. And that is an explanation that I think fits, for me, more with stories that I've heard from autistic women describing their childhoods and their subsequent development of more serious difficulties as they entered adolescence. And I think it fits with this idea, when we think of autism and the difficulties that autistic people face, those difficulties are not an inherent property of the autistic person. Yeah? What they reflect is a mismatch between the autistic person and their particular set of capacities and the environment and the demands that are being made on that autistic person by the environment. So we could have a situation where the demands of the environment are escalating rapidly during the transition to secondary school and the move into adolescence, which could then be outstripping the difficulties of some females and causing those what were previously subtle social communication difficulties, but which really weren't problematic in the primary school environment, to become more overt and then to show up in terms of parent report. So again, we need to do more work to try and tease apart some of these alternative explanations, but certainly given our work qualitative work interviewing autistic women. There are indeed actually some suggestive findings as well that the social environment escalates in complexity faster for girls than it does for boys around adolescence. So again, that would fit with this hypothesis of perhaps a kind of growth in social difficulties faced by autistic girls, partly reflecting an escalation in the demands placed on them by the environment.